So to Essence's point, this is exactly how I feel about James too. Like, he does this thing really consistently throughout this entire time that we've been studying this, throughout the entire book. He has this way of just like calling these things out that are kind of seemingly easy for us to overlook or maybe even to justify as what we would consider to be like experienced believers. It's like, yeah, like we know this thing might be wrong, or we know that we don't do that. But what are the ways that we maybe like make adjustments for ourselves? We justify things that aren't right. So as we've mentioned already this morning, James does not mince any words in calling us out. And the way that he does it, he has this way of like breaking our heart open to help us, to help in revealing the sin that maybe is still lingering in there, that maybe we're not willing to face, or maybe that we're just like kind of oblivious to. And so he does that in this passage in addressing our assumptions that we're the ones that are in control of our lives. In fact, our routine, our everyday routine in life kind of confirms this idea that we are in control. And so it's in simple things, like in the way that we can just like make a plan for the day, make a plan for the week. We decide really like mundane things like what we're going to eat and what we're going to wear and how we're going to spend our free time. We decide what night we're going to have, our micro churches meet, and we decide what night our pickleball team is going to meet or whatever, right? We do this with technology, like even in who we follow online and how we get our information. There's a sense of control as to like who we're going to listen to and what we find credible. We do this with our finances. We feel like we have control over how we budget, over how we spend, over how we save. And even in our own like physical well-being, like we feel like we have the control to keep ourselves healthy by exercising or what we eat. There's tons of different kinds of like eating plans, and everyone, thinks that they're going to be healthy because they did this one, and we feel like we have the control to pick and choose and decide what that's going to be. I'm sure you can think of other things, but all of these things reinforce the sense of control that we have. Inevitably, though, there's always going to be moments that stop us in our tracks, and they confront us with the truth that we definitely do not have control over our lives. Prime example of this would be the pandemic, right? Like I was trying to think of an example and I was like having like the hardest time, and it's like, Tommy's like, what about the pandemic? I'm like, oh yeah, that was a thing. It happened. The pandemic changed how we would usually plan for our milestone moments, things that are like a given, how we do birthdays, how we do weddings, graduations, and funerals, right? It turned them into these like really weird and awkward moments that we would have never planned for ourselves. Like whoever thought we would be like excited about a drive-through graduation, or God forbid, drive-through funeral, like the devastation of how that changed us not being able to have control over how we express those things. Life as per usual came to a full stop, and we went from making day-to-day plans and even plans for the future, what we would do, where we would go, what we wanted to accomplish. We went from that to not even knowing what would happen the next week, the next month. Forget even trying to think about the next year. We didn't even know what would be available to us at the grocery store, much less when we would see people in person again, when we would travel, when all of the like uncertainty and pain around us would finally come to an end. So JD and I own a business, and anybody in here that's a business owner knows that you're making plans annually for your business, how to grow, how to reach new people, how to grow your client base, how to offer new products. And we started out 2020 with a plan, and by March, it blew up. There was no plan. In fact, many of our clients and many of our friends that also own businesses had to close up shop, and we just had no idea if we would end up the same way. And so the uncertainty that we felt with all the things that changed around us in what felt like a moment left us feeling disoriented and feeling frustrated, feeling powerless, and maybe even dare to say feeling hopeless. And there's this really interesting way that like hope and planning are intertwined. And it's that if there's no hope for the future, no hope towards the goal, then there's no point in the planning of that thing. And on the other side of that, if there's no way to like plan out like what's the word I'm thinking for? Like practical steps towards achieving something, then we actually don't have hope in that thing ever happening. So like, what does this look like? That might sound like a lot of words. I get it. I'm sorry. That could look like aspirations for maybe a particular career path. You want to be a teacher. You want to be a doctor. You want to be a fill in the blank. Well, there are steps that you take that you can plan towards to actually like check off your list. This is what I need to do to attain this thing. If those things are not available to you, then there's no hope in actually becoming this thing that you want to have as a profession. I mentioned health and fitness. It's like you have like a fitness goal. We've seen this happen time and time again. Like it's like, I'm going to do this thing. I've chosen the method I'm going to take to like get healthy, to get in shape, to get whatever. And then when that starts to feel hopeless or unattainable, or like we can't keep up with that, we lose hope for actually being able to achieve the kind of health that we're wanting. This also happens like in our relationships. We have like this deep desire for like connection and like genuine friendship and genuine community, right? But if it feels like that's closed off to us in some way for some reason, like we don't have hope of actually being able to attain that. And so there's this sense of hopelessness. So a couple of weeks ago, Jeremy covered the beginning of this chapter, and it talks about our desires and how when our desires are left unchecked, they have a tendency to bring out the worst in us, leading us to fighting and waging war in our selfishness, and leading us into forging a friendship with the world. This friendship tells us that what gives our life meaning and what makes it even worth living is our ability to control it and to fulfill our desires. Not being able to do this is seen as some sort of like denial of some kind of inalienable rights. But what I think this passage is telling us this morning is that in a culture that encourages us to bend and shape reality, the reality of life to our will, God is reminding us this morning that our life itself is held in his hands. This passage starts out in verse 13 by saying, "Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will travel to such and such a city and spend a year there and do business and make a profit." These guys definitely have a plan, and along with that, they're making some assumptions. 4, actually. They're assuming when things are going to happen, they're assuming where they're going to go, they're assuming what they're going to do, and they're assuming outcomes to this plan. I will be honest, when I first got this passage, I read this passage before. When I got it to start preparing for this talk, I'm like, if I'm really honest with myself, I actually don't see what's wrong with his plan. It's like, okay, yeah, like it sounds like a first plan. And that's like, when you have a problem, it's like, if I have an issue with what the Bible is saying, like I'm the problem. So I quickly recognized I was the problem. To me, it sounds actually like a well thought out plan. Like it's not just like I'm going to make a profit. Like I'm like planning out the steps, like how I'm going to go and do that. Right. And if I try to put myself in the merchant's context, which is, they're talking about like a merchant here. If I put myself in the merchant's context, I'm like, okay, so he's planning towards goals. He has some ambition. He's planning for his future. Probably he's even planning as to like how he's going to provide for his family. Like, what is wrong with that? Calling it boastful and arrogant. And like Tommy was saying, like, it was called evil making this kind of plan. It felt like really extreme. And that's likely because I recognize how easily I make plans like this for myself. Plans that I think are good and wise and maybe even prudent in some way. And so we're faced with the question, is it wrong for us to make plans? Is it sinful for us to have goals? I don't think that that's what this passage is saying. Because if that were the case, then why would God have gifted us with the ability to like think and reason and use creativity? In some way, there's an aspect of being able to plan and execute those plans that gives meaning to our lives. But is there a way that we can be arrogant and boastful in the way that we do this? It doesn't sound like there's any arrogance or boasting from the merchant when we're first reading this until James presents us with the what we ought to do part, like Jeremy mentioned. It says, instead, what you ought to say is, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. If the Lord wills. These 4 words put into sharp focus the one who is actually in charge, and it's not us. The problem isn't in planning, but in their act of godlessness and assuming that they're in control and not considering God's sovereignty. We see this in the world around us all the time. Our culture has a bit of an obsession with the idea that we have the power within ourselves to control the course of our lives, which clearly contradicts what James is saying in this passage. In studying this section of scripture, I came across a term called expressive individualism. And big word, sorry. We're going to break it down. And so expressive individualism is where we look inwards to find our identity and our desires. Once we look inward and determine what our identity is going to be and our desires, then we find ways to express that outwardly to the world around us. We see this idea of expressive individualism in the word manifesting that's become very popular everywhere. Manifest, yes. Our culture uses the word manifesting to tell us that we have control over our lives. We have control over what it's going to look like. We have control over what we want and how we're going to get it. It's the idea that we have control of making our desired outcomes a reality, and how we practice mindfulness and meditation, like the law of attraction, pretty much. The point is that to manifest, we don't need anyone else but ourselves to decide what we want and to make it a reality. We're able to bend and shape our reality solely based on our will. And it's the world's attempt at answering the question of what is your life? And its answer to that being whatever I say it is. As followers of Jesus and missionaries, it might be easy for us to read through this passage and feel like, okay, like that's good word, but like I've already dealt with the I and the me in my heart, especially in light of all the sacrifices that we've made. Sacrifices in the things that we've given up to follow Jesus. Sacrifices we've made for pursuing his call to mission and for the people that we serve. While the world tells us to look in first to ourselves, to know who we are and to know what our own desires are, the gospel tells us to look up first, which is exactly what I think those of us in this room are trying to do. But are there ways that we let that I make its way back into the driver's seat of our planning and our decision making? Maybe that looks like when things feel like they're going wrong, are we tempted to take control of the situation on our own? Or maybe things are going right and we're tempted to attribute that to our own good planning and our own abilities. Maybe that looks like when God's plans or timing or silence leaves us with more questions than answers, and we're tempted to move forward in our own ideas. Or maybe that looks like when the diagrams and algorithms and pipelines for ministry that have been successful for others sound wise, and so we're tempted to make them into a template for us to follow, instead of taking into consideration what God might actually be wanting us to do. When we think of temptation, we tend to think of the things that are like our fleshly desires, the things that pull at our heart that we have to resist. But there is a greater temptation, which is the foundation of all others, and that's the temptation towards godlessness. There's a man by the name of Trevin Wax. He is a former missionary, he's a teacher, and a writer now. And he talks about this idea of godlessness. He describes godlessness not as the presence of sin, but as the absence of God. And now we're not talking about like this like disbelief in God or like a complete rejection of God. It's more of living our lives in a way that puts God on the sidelines, letting him wait there to be called in for when things don't go as planned and when we come to the realization that we've lost all control. This sidelining of God doesn't happen overnight or happen all at once even, but it's the gradual move where our I starts to crowd out the great I am and who Jesus is. Our good planning, desires, and strategies and ambitions start to lose eternal perspective when we look in first instead of up. It puts us at risk of starting to invite Jesus into what we are doing instead of accepting his invitation into what he is already doing. So how does this happen? How do we go from our first love having center stage to taking a supporting role in our life and our decision making? Wax attributes this to prayerlessness in his writing, and he says, the clearest sign that we've succumbed to the temptation of forgetting or sidelining God is prayerlessness. The absence of prayer is what exposes and unmasks our self-sufficient spirit. The absence of prayer is what proves we see the real world, quotations, the real world, as one of power, of politics, of work and leisure, or even of ministry. That we've accepted a dichotomy between the spiritual churchiness realm and the earthly rough and tumble. Meanwhile, the God who strips away our illusions of grandeur and self-dependence is set aside. Were we to truly see our need, our dependence on the one who has called us, we would summon his presence with quiet desperation, begging that he might allow us to taste and see his goodness, to experience the experience the freshness of his tender touch alongside the white hot fire of his holiness. What are the areas that we can identify in our own lives that we resist prayer? There have been many seasons of my life where prayer has been a struggle to start, a struggle to linger there. The easiest times are when I'm desperate and fully aware of how much I am not in control and need saving, even if that saving is from myself. Maybe an increase in resistance to prayer is due to an increase in our self-confidence. It's not that we don't want to pray, but feel like we don't need to because we're confident in our own knowledge and experience. Many of us started ministry not knowing a whole lot. We were just excited to be obedient to the voice of God. But the reality is that with time comes experience. And that even in ministry, there are aspects of it that we can learn. We can learn how to give a good Bible study. We can learn how to share our faith. We can learn how to throw great parties to get people in. We can learn how to throw a great outreach. And we learn like what works. We would never say in a million years that we don't need God. We would never verbalize that. But we can't start going about living like we actually don't need him. Because we already know what we're supposed to do to make things work. And if we find that we don't know and we need a little inspiration, a quick search in Google, YouTube, podcasts, blog, books, the list goes on. ChatGPT, did you say that? ChatGPT, please don't do that. It's at our fingertips, ready to fill in the gaps for us. Maybe God allows the disruptions in our plans to happen so that our desperation will remind us of him. He allows for us to be reminded how fragile our life is so that we can find comfort in knowing that our lives are held in his hands. It keeps us close to the side of Jesus, who is trustworthy with our future. We make peace with the question of what is my life when our prayer life reflects who's the one in control of it. We accept his invitation into what he's doing instead of trying to offer him an invitation into what we're doing. Now, this isn't a call to not make plans. We should plan. We should put effort and thought into what it is that we're doing, but making them in a way that acknowledges that he's in control and that I'm not. That he's the one who's capable of shaping my life, that is held together in his capable hands, And from the large scale of life goals and ambitions to the smaller scale of our day to day, we either give him control or we're trying to keep it for ourselves. If the worship team wants to come up, I'm going to start wrapping this up here. So I grew up as an only child. Only children. I got one. Got one. Are they, you see, so this is my dilemma, is that I'm not sure if all only children feel this way, but I really wanted siblings. Like, really wanted siblings. Everybody's like, oh, you're so lucky. I'm like, no, I really wanted some siblings. But I come from a Puerto Rican family, so I was fortunate. So I was given lots of cousins instead of siblings. Lots of cousins. And if you come from a family where you're an only child, I mean, I guess if you have cousins in general, like, you always have a favorite. So I had a favorite. And his name was Eric. And Eric was about 3 or 4 years older than me. And oh man, he was the one that like when you have a big family gathering and you're like there waiting, because like you're waiting for that one to show up, so like you can feel at home and know it's going to be like a good time. So Eric was that for me for sure. And I was pretty lucky because Eric grew up a few blocks away from where I did, so we got to see each other a whole bunch. He was always trying to teach me things. He was the only cousin that would let me actually physically turn the pages of his comic books instead of making me look at them like in plastic sleeves. If anybody can identify with that. And he was like a brother to me in every way. Eric was very protective of me. So one of my favorite stories growing up of Eric is that I had a bully in middle school. He would have been in high school already, but I had a bully in middle school one time. And all Eric had to do was find out that somebody was trying to mess with me. And he got his older friends who could drive. He would sneak out of school. They would drive him to my school. And he had gone to my school previously, so he knew how to get around. And he would walk me to my classes to make sure that nobody messed with me. I always thought he was like such a hero for that. And now as an adult, I'm like, what were you doing skipping school? Like, how were you able to do this so frequently? Like, there was other things happening there. But that was Eric. And Eric you can tell from that story, he just like loved fiercely. And he was always like, giving bear hugs and like had like this huge smile that just like lit up any space he was in. Because he was that way, to know him, unless you knew him very personally, you would never know how hard life was for him. And Eric grew up with a really tough adolescence. His teenage years were super rough. Preteen, teenage years. They were marked by his dad being in prison and his mom secretly battling alcoholism. Even as a family, we didn't know she was battling alcoholism, but he did. And he dealt with the challenges that come with growing up in a house like that. As a teenager, he looked to the world for love and belonging, and that ended up separating us for quite some time. And I missed him, and I felt abandoned by him. After all, he was like my brother. And so one day, I was like 14 years old, so Eric would have been about like 17 or 18 years old. My mom gets a call from him, like random, out of the blue. Hadn't seen or heard from him in quite a long time. And he calls, and he wants to come over. And he doesn't just want to come over, but he wants to come over and eat. And specifically, he wants to eat chicken cutlets, rice and beans. That was his favorite. And that was my mom's specialty. When he came over, that's what mom made. Right? So he calls, he wants to come over and eat. And so my mom's not here this morning, but anybody that knows her well knows that my mama is a planner. I get that from her. I'm a hardcore planner. And she lives by a calendar. That calendar is close. I think, if I'm not mistaken, she has two. She has like a backup, like just in case she's not home. Like she has like her purse one to make sure everything is matched up and lined up, and she knows what's happening day to day. She has her stuff on there. She has my stuff. She knows when I have a meeting, sometimes even before I do, because I told her like 2 weeks ago. She puts it on her calendar. And so, my mom is not one for spontaneity, being that she lives by this calendar. Like, it's etched in there. So she would normally respond to this last minute request by anybody else with like that's a great idea. Let's see what's on the calendar for next week, right? Or like, let's make a plan for that. Absolutely. But not this day. This day, she said yes right away. And so dinner was on. Eric was going to come over and eat. And so he comes over that night, and I was super excited to see him. I was super excited. It had been already a few years, I would say, at least a couple, since we had seen each other. But because I felt so like hurt and abandoned by him, I wasn't going to let him know that I was excited. I was 14. I was not going to let him know that I was excited. I wanted him to know that I was not happy with him. So I actually didn't talk to him very much. Not at all. He sat right next to me. I really didn't talk to him very much. My mom took on most of the conversation, and, you know, the typical things that you talk about when you haven't seen each other for a long time. How are you? What's going on? What's new? Kind of those monotonous kind of questions. He was only there for a couple hours, I would say. It wasn't very long. But I distinctly remember this conversation that my mom has with him, like he's getting his shoes on, getting ready to walk out the door. I remember this really brief conversation my mom has with him. And I love my mom. She is fiery, and she's not afraid to just like ask you questions that make you feel uncomfortable. So my mom's like, "Hey, Eric, why don't you come to youth group? There's a bunch of kids that are your age there. I think it would be really great." And so in a Puerto Rican family, we call our auntie Titi. So he says, "Titi, I know a lot of the kids that are in that youth group. I know what they're like not in youth group. I am not interested in being a part of anything that they're a part of." And she's like, "Okay, I get it." She's like, "Okay, why don't you just come to church with me then?" She's like, "It's really just about having a relationship with Jesus. Don't worry about the youth group and what they do outside of that. Just come to church with me." And Eric got quiet, and he looked at her and he was like, "Didi, there's a lot of things I need to clean up before I go to church. There's a lot of things I need to clean up in my life. I'm not ready for that." And my mom says to him, "No, that is where you are wrong, my love." She was like, "You do not need to clean up anything." She was like, "Jesus just wants you to come. And if there's whatever needs to be cleaned up, you just come and he'll take care of it. He'll deal with it. But don't wait. You can just come." And so Eric gives her this look, kind of like a little surprised, like, "Really? Like, okay, just come. All right. I'll think about it. I'll think about it." And with that, he gave us hugs, and he gave us kisses, and he said goodbye, and he left. 48 hours later, Eric would die in a car crash. How in the world would any of us have known that that was our last dinner together? Last time we would see him? Eric was like 17 or 18, and I'm sure he thought he had plenty of time in front of him to take my mom up on her invitation to go and sit with her in church. I'm sure he thought that just as much as I thought I had plenty of time to love on him and to tell him how excited I was to see him, and to let us be like we once were when we were kids. And I don't know what the 48 hours between dinner and the car crash held for him. I don't know who he saw. I don't know what other conversations he had. I don't even know what he did or what he thought about. But maybe A relationship with his creator was on his mind. Maybe he even prayed. Maybe he had a conversation with God, now knowing that he didn't have to clean up his life before he could do that. And 25 years later, it is still the secret pain of my life, the quiet pain of my life, to not know if he ever came to faith in Jesus. But I do have hope. And I have hope because for whatever reason that day, my mom had no idea that by going against the grain of how she plans and structures her life, she would make space for a divine appointment to give the good news of come as you are to one whose life was just about to run out. How are we tempted to keep a sense of control over our life? Is it maybe in our rigid planning? Maybe we're so sure of what it is that we want to do and what we want to accomplish that we don't leave room for Jesus to come in, for the Holy Spirit to change things up. Maybe it's in believing that we have all the time in the world. Maybe it's by attaching the outcomes of our plans to how we feel about ourselves and how the world perceives us instead of what it is that Jesus is actually asking us to do. Maybe it's by our overconfidence in all of our knowing and in all of our experience as to how to accomplish things instead of depending on the one who sets our life on course. We need a reminder that our lives, down to our very next breath, is passed through the will of God. And maybe that reminder is something as simple as a regular inclusion of the words, if the Lord wills, we will live, and fill in the blank. Maybe our call this morning is to repent for the ways we try to bend our life to our own will, and for the ways we forget that our very life itself is held together by the hand of God, and that He's sovereign over the big and the small in our everyday lives.